everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and as you may have noticed from the title of today's video, we are going to look at reskeining hand-dyed yarn and talk about the pros and the cons for doing it. Now, what is reskeining? When you have your circular skein of yarn that you dye, reskeining is the process of taking this, putting it on a swift, and creating a new circle from the original. And there are many reasons why you may need to do so. Maybe your skein got really messy, or it is a preference of some dyers to do so. The main times that I personally end up reskeining yarn is when I'm doing, say, something that is self-striping and the skein is mega long, too long for someone to easily manage. So as part of the dyeing process, I go ahead and reskein that before I list it in my shop. But we're not going to just talk about the pros and cons of reskeining your hand-dyed yarn. I am going to dye two different types of colorways and show before and after reskeining, so that way we can do a comparison of the yarn to really help us talk about those pros and cons. But before we go start dyeing yarn, this is just an example that has been featured in another video. Before we go and start dyeing the two different colorways, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner today, Lindsay Liu. Lindsay, thank you so much for being my lab partner today, and I'm really excited to dye this yarn. Now, I want to dye two different types of colorways because for some kinds of colors that you dye, it will make a bigger impact whether you reskein or not. So we are going to do a hand painted variegated colorway on the countertop where we'll have maybe not super precise, but we'll have more precise control over the color placement. And then we will also do a speckled colorway. And so then we can look at the pros and cons of reskeining either of these. But since I don't want you to wait until the end, at the end we'll see the practical examples, I do want to share a few pros and cons right now. A pro of leaving yarn as it is dyed is that you can open up the skein and see how it was dyed. You get a sense of, are these colors regularly repeating? Do the colors change size as you go through the skein? Are the colors random? Things like that. But a pro for reskeining the yarn is that sometimes when you have a variegated yarn, it's hard to envision how that might look knit when the colors blend together a bit more. So when it's reskeined, looking at the yarn, you can get a better feel for how those colors are. But when it's reskeined, it's hard to know the size of the various color repeats, and it can be hard to know the order of the colors and things like that. Plus, reskeining is an extra step in your process. So I am very much team leave the yarn as it's dyed unless there are circumstances that mean that you should do something else. But this is why I'm going to share two different examples and you can make up your own mind. But let me know down in the comments which team you fall onto. For our variegated hand-painted colorway, we are going to dye 200 grams of Swish DK yarn. This yarn is 100% superwash merino and it dyes up beautifully. I pre-soaked the yarn in some water with vinegar and I am laying it out on some plastic wrap because after we paint the colors onto the yarn, we're going to roll it up and steam set it so that way the colors don't spread. Now this is a technique I don't do as much anymore, and a reason for that is that I try to avoid using excess plastics as much as possible. But to get a colorway where we have more control over where the color placements are, you want to be able to prevent the colors from spreading into one another, so this technique works nicely. Now we are going to be using three different colors today. We have some green, some blue, and some yellow from Paradise Fibers Acid Dyes. The green is much more of a teal color, as you can see right here, but it is really pretty and I enjoy it. Now I'm using one of my favorite application methods for hand painting, and that is using these wide foam brushes to apply the dye. This allows me to really control the placement of the colors, and it also helps me avoid adding too much liquid. Now, since I don't have guar gum or any kind of thickener in these dyes, that means that we will see some color spread from where we place them. So things aren't gonna be like perfectly sharp as they would if we had a thickener in there, but that is also okay. Now, I have found that these Paradise Fibers acid dyes do spread a fair amount into the yarn, but that is also fine. And so my plan is to have these sections of white and smaller sections of color. We will flip the yarn and add more dye to the other side at some point, but I wanted to have something that is got a repeating variegated nature to it, where our patches of color are a bit smaller. I am not concerned about having a super regular pattern for the colors, especially because since this is a circle and we are dyeing half of it, it'll go back and forth as the color will go back and forth like with each round. Some of the white patches might be bigger than others, but this is a much less random way of having colors placed than we will see later on when I do my speckles. But because of the way we have this, the color right now will go yellow with the interspersed with white, yellow, blue, teal, yellow, blue, teal, and then teal, blue, yellow, teal, blue, yellow. So that is how that'll work out. There is a little bit of randomness to where I place these colors, but because I don't have things pretty spread out on the counter, there will be a repeating nature to this colorway. Once I finished adding the dye to the first side, I flipped the yarn and then started applying colors in the same place as before on the other side of our skein, making sure to wipe any dye I see off of the plastic wrap before doing that flip. Now I am going to wipe the color again. We will check, oh dear, don't want to spill that. We will check and see how much color we have in the interior here to see if we need to add any more, but we're actually getting excellent, if you can see, color penetration in here. Yeah, I am very, very happy with what we see. So now I need to go set up the steamer basket so we can steam set this yarn. But until we are ready, I am going to just leave this here. Now it is time to fold this up so we can steam set it. So I'm going to start off by folding these sides in a little bit, and then we are going to fold this end over and start folding the yarn to roll it up. This way we have a layer of plastic in between each of the different colors, so we shouldn't see color transfer to areas where we don't want it. The one thing you do want to do is make sure that you don't squeeze it, but since we didn't apply that much liquid, things should stay put pretty well. And now we are at my steamer basket. This is a dedicated dye pot, and we are going to do our best to fit the yarn in without squeezing very much. And I am going to turn on the heat, and we're going to steam set this for 30 minutes. Okay, the 30 minutes are up. We are very steamy, and I am going to take our yarn and set it aside to cool completely so we can wash it. And now let's go and dye a speckled colorway. For our second colorway, I want to create something that is more random with the color placement to start with. So we are going to add on some speckles on the countertop using 3 different colors of Dharma acid dyes: Berry Crush, Blued Steel, and Blazing Orange. All 3 of these colors are quite pigmented, so a little will go a long way. And since the plan is to have more random color placement, I am not going to use plastic wrap because it'll be okay if the yarn touches itself and we have color transfer from one section of the yarn to another. This time when I am spreading out the yarn, I don't want it to be quite as neat. I am going to sort of spread and scrunch it up a bit. This gives me exposure to more of the yarn at any given time, plus will help make the random color application a bit more random. This yarn is Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And I am going to have a 3rd skein of this base on hand, slightly off camera, for me to wipe my gloved fingertips onto as we are dyeing the yarn, because each time I go into a new color, I want to make sure my gloves are dry and clean, so that way I don't contaminate any of these jars with a different color. And all of the yarn was pre-soaked in some water plus vinegar. Since we are dealing with dry dye powder, I am now wearing my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. And with each color, I'm going to take a small pinch of dye and speckle it on. I like to go in diagonals while I'm adding on the color versus straight lines, because it helps with the randomness a bit. And then I'm going to take little bits and add it to some other fairly more random locations on this yarn. Now, depending on how heavy I am, and we're now wiping the gloves onto our yarn mop, but depending on how heavy we end up applying this color, we will likely also have a fair amount of white left behind here as well. The main difference is that our color placement is a bit more random to begin with. And our 2 skeins are therefore less matched than they were in the first colorway, just because there is a lot more randomness to where we are applying the color here. And the reason why you want your gloves to be nice and dry when you're coming in with the colors is because if they're damp, the dye will stick, and then you might not get the kind of effect you want. But I'm really not adding much color at all, except occasionally when I add a little bit more than I thought. It's sort of like the more color that you add, the more it may spread when we go to steam set it. So that is always worth keeping in mind. But now with clean and damp hands, I am going to gently flip the yarn over, sort of open it, which is causing a little bit of some color spread. Things aren't going to strike nearly as quickly as they would if we had some heat involved as well. So I'm trying to not rub the yarn, but we can dry off my hands and start applying color to the other side. Using the same technique, I applied the 3 colors to the other side of our yarn, trying to focus on areas that felt a little bit more empty as I placed the colors, which are very randomly distributed over this yarn. And so this is a case where once we reskein, it's probably going to make less of a difference because the colors are more randomly distributed already. I then opened up the inside of the skein, which actually had a fair amount of color already because of the way I spread things out. Our powders would go through multiple layers of the yarn. And then I applied just a little bit more of the orange and blued steel because visually there was a lot of pink there already. And then we're all set with the actual speckling portion. Now I am going to take our beautiful yarn over to the steamer basket and steam set it for 30 minutes. And meanwhile, with this dye that we have left on the counter, we can come in with this yarn mop and wipe up this color. That way we leave no dye behind. And as I'm doing this, for this bonus skein, I am going and looking for areas that maybe have larger sections of white and using those as the mop. And once my steamer basket is clear, then I will go ahead and steam set this yarn for 30 minutes as well. It has been 30 minutes, and now I'm going to take our more randomly colored speckled yarn that actually has a fair amount of color. This is the thing with using straight dye powder. It's really easy to go overboard with how much you add. I see a little bit of color on the surface of this steamer basket, but I'm now going to steam set our yarn mop for 30 minutes. And once everything cools, then we can go and wash all of the yarn. And now that the yarn mop is done, I'm going to go ahead and set it with the other speckled yarn. Now before we reskein, I will point out that there are some differences between the two speckled yarns, but I still think that the reskeining will likely be less dramatic than what we'll see with the more variegated yarn. But anyway, everything still needs to cool so we can wash it. Especially since we want the yarn to be dry before we reskein it so that way we don't stretch it in any kind of way. Let's start off washing the speckled yarn and our yarn mop, since this was more accessible already. I think I've already mentioned, and here is our mop with the smoother colors, but one of these skeins has a little bit more white in it already. There's some just a little fewer larger patches. So I don't know which one of them I will choose to reskein, but I am excited. Either way. Okay, I am seeing a little bit of some bleeding right now, which is not super alarming because we applied dry powder on the countertop. There is a chance that we have some undissolved dye, and I'm now adding some dish soap. There's a chance that we have some undissolved dye on the surface of some of the yarn, because without taking the time to like pat the dye on the yarn, if there was a larger clump, then well, that could be dissolving right now. And so that's why like the first rinse or two, bleeding is not something that I worry about a ton. And now with the soap, it's already significantly reduced, which is an excellent sign. So I am going to fill this basin up with water and let it soak for a couple of minutes, and then we'll continue washing. Okay, let's see. Well, that is already looking really, really great. Wow, I don't think I'm seeing... Sometimes it's hard to know if it's a reflection or anything, but there was maybe, if there's any, it's the lightest possible blush. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse this a few more times off camera, but it does appear that we probably had some just dissolved dye on the surface and that everything left is well set. And so then we'll come back and look at our variegated yarn. Here is our variegated yarn. And ooh, the yellow is looking rather pigmented. So let's see how we did. With any luck, well, and proper planning, I don't see maybe like a spot or two where some color spread, but otherwise this is looking really, really wonderful. Really wonderful. And so far I don't see any color bleeding, but let's add some soap. There's a touch of some dish soap. There may have actually been some soap in one of the brushes because when I was painting, it seemed like it may have been foaming a little bit. And oh, this is really fun. Okay, I am seeing a little bit of some bleeding. Yeah, I mean, we will wash and see how we're doing. I'll come back when I'm ready to rinse. But while I'm at it, I'll add just a touch more soap. All right, let's see. Where's the other zip tie? Yeah, I am seeing, I'm not sure if it's the green or the blue or a little bit of both. Actually, it could be almost any combination except for just yellow. If some yellow is bleeding, it is not just the yellow. But I'm gonna go ahead and rinse this some more times off camera, and I'll check back in once it has resolved. All right, it's only been 2 rinses later, and I would say we are looking rather clear. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop this into the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and then we'll chat about reskeining. Looking at our hand-painted Swish DK, when we lay it out as it was dyed, you can really see the color progression. You can see that it's not a perfect repeating order of where these colors are placed, that we have some smaller patches of white and larger patches of white in between each of the colors. And while there is a randomness, there is a repetition to it. But now I'm gonna go ahead and reskein one of these. So with the Swift off camera, I'm gonna use my Crazy Musky automated skein winder to reskein this yarn. And I have tried, I didn't really measure the size, but I've tried to pick a similar size. It may be a little smaller or a little bigger to what the original skein looked like. And in a couple of minutes, it will be done. And here we go. Looking at the reskein yarn while it is still on the skein winder, you can see that the colors are now more distributed and blended, and it no longer is as it was dyed. It really doesn't take a big difference in the overall size to suddenly have a difference in where the colors are placed. But let's look at this next to the other skein. In this example, it is super easy to tell the reskeined yarn from the yarn as it was dyed. And as I mentioned, there are pluses and minuses to each. The biggest perk of reskeining here is that you get a better feel of how these colors would work up if you were to weave, knit, or crochet with this yarn. You can see how, especially from further back, the blue and green really stand out a lot more than the yellow and the white, and it gives you a feel of how the colors would mix together, and therefore could help you decide, okay, maybe this yarn wouldn't work well for lace or cables because there's a lot of contrast within it. A con for reskeining is that you can't tell from this yarn what the order of colors is really easily. You may look at a section of this yarn and think, okay, it goes green, white, blue, white, yellow, white, and then that repeats. But that isn't actually the case. And so this level of repeating or not doesn't necessarily matter for a project, but if you're trying to gauge whether a skein may work for, say, planned pooling, especially when it is a repetitive colorway like this one, which is technically a repetitive colorway, it's just the repeat is on a bigger scale than it might appear when you're looking at the reskeined yarn. Not that I think that this colorway is a good candidate for some kind of planned pooling project, but it's just an example to show that you don't necessarily know the order of the colors just from looking at the reskeined yarn. Another pro of reskeining I haven't mentioned is that sometimes through the dyeing process you can get a skein that is a little messy and out of order. So reskeining the yarn can help make it look pretty, make it less likely to be tangled further when caking it later on. So reskeining can have a practical purpose and sometimes a necessary purpose. But since reskeining adds more time to the finishing process of yarn, that's probably the biggest reason that, and I like to see yarn as it was dyed, that I don't personally do it. But let's go look at a second example. Here is our speckled yarn. And while there are circumstances where it looks like, oh, there is some kind of pattern, there is a randomness to the color placements here that I don't think it's gonna make a huge difference when we look at as it was dyed versus reskeined. I think there will be a difference, but I'm expecting it to be a bit more subtle this time. Now, one of these skeins, this one right here, has a little bit more of some white patches. And so I think that's the one I want to reskein just to see how things look. But this one does have some white in it as well. So let's go reskein. And here we go. You know, I don't remember the bluish color that I used for this colorway. It looks very, very gray. I'm trying to see if there might be a hint of brown to the color because was it blued steel? Was it a color that maybe has broken in the past? I'm not really sure. But I will pop back over once we can look at the finished reskeined yarn. I think I used so much of the dry powder when I was speckling that we ended up with more spread and less sharp speckles than at least appearing on the as dyed skein than maybe we would have if I had mixed this dry dye powder with citric acid to really help get sharper speckles. If we had random sharper speckles, I think that the difference with reskeining wouldn't be as noticeable. But I do think we're going to see a bit of a difference here, which I say because I can see both skeins now. That was not necessarily my original hypothesis, but I do think that these two skeins are going to feel more similar than the last example. This time, our reskeined yarn feels both more muted and a lot more speckled than the other one. And I think that this is because the larger patches of white are more blended in to the yarn overall. So once again, you can get a better feel of how this yarn might knit up. Because if you imagine the bottom skein as a sock, you know, it wouldn't translate exactly that way, but that's the kind of color mixing that you could expect. You aren't necessarily going to see the colors pool as they are, even though randoms, a little more pooled in it was as it was dyed. This is so pretty. I mean, I don't think that this is a problem for visualizing how something would knit up. In this example, I think that looking at this yarn, you not only get a feel of how it knits up, but you can also get a feel that the color placement is really random because it is. And that randomness is somewhat present here, but again, since we got a lot of spread, I think it's a little harder to see some of the randomness as it was dyed. And so the brightness here is still present on the bottom skein when you look at it closely. But if you're comparing sort of the average, the bottom feels a lot more muted. I will admit, I was going for something that would be less dramatic than this. This ended up being a dramatic reskeining example as well. And my personal preference is still to see the yarn as it was dyed. But I think that if you have a shop and you dye a lot of the same colorways over and over, having an example of the yarn caked or reskeined can be helpful for the buyer. And I think that if I did a lot of repeatable colorways in my shop, then I would want to have either pictures of caked yarn or of swatches or something. But since I dye so many small batches of yarn, I just don't have the capacity to swatch everything that I dye. But that's another story. But I've talked about that many times before. Finally, we have our yarn mop, which, it's funny, it looks fairly different from both of them right here. But it would not look nearly as speckled as our speckly skein on the bottom. And that you can tell from comparing it to the speckled skein as it was dyed. You can see how the color changes on this yarn mop are a lot softer. We do have some speckles here, but the colors are a bit more pastel and a bit more spread. Looking at both of our examples where we have our yarn as it was dyed and then reskeined, I do think that the hand painted one has a more dramatic difference between the as it was dyed and the reskeined colorway. But let's go twist these skeins up. Ultimately, reskeining yarn is a personal preference. And I personally wouldn't bother, except for some of the cases like I mentioned earlier where the skein was disordered and I needed to clean it up because maybe there were some, it caught on something and there was a strand out of order, or I was dyeing self-striping yarn and the skein is way too big for most swifts to accommodate, so it is a better customer service to have it reskeined for the customer. Beyond that, I like seeing how the yarn was dyed to get a sense of the color order, the placement, is it random or repeating, and things like that. And the same goes for me with sock blanks. I like to see as they are dyed because it's easier for me to visualize how the colors may progress, how asymmetric the colorway might be, which is harder to tell once it is skeined up. Would you like me to go through this process again with some other examples of how yarn looks before and after reskeining? I would be happy to do so if there is interest, and potentially do a hand-painted variegated yarn that has no white in it, potentially, plus a speckled yarn where the speckles are more dispersed, so there's more of the original base color present, to again see just the different ways that yarn can look like when it is reskeined. But again, I think that the hand-painted has a much bigger difference than our speckled colorway. Lindsay Lou, thank you so much for being my lab partner for this episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you are going to enjoy your yarn. And again, if you at home want to learn more about how you can become a lab partner, go and check out the details in the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. And if you have any questions about it, feel free to message me on Etsy to chat more about the listings and the differences there. Anyway, Lindsay, thank you again so much for being my lab partner today. I do have some requests to do some videos on some other parts of the dyeing process that I don't always share. I already have some videos on my channel about using, say, a niddy noddy, and well, those may need some updating, so I could make a more recent one of some of those really ancient videos. But I've also had requests to see, you know, how I dry my yarn and things like that. So if there are other steps to my yarn dyeing or YouTube filming process that you're interested in learning more about, let me know in the comments, and I'd be happy to share some more of those aspects. While you're at it, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps the channel so much. And well, thank you so much for watching.